Welcome to Sustainability Decoded with Tim
and Caitlin.
On our podcast, we break down what's happening in climate, sustainability, and ESG.
And along the way, we help you get smarter about sustainability. So let's get into it.
Our guest today has been in the sustainability industry as long as my co-host Caitlin has been alive. Paul Dickinson is the founder of the Climate Disclosure Project, or CDP, a nonprofit that collects voluntary disclosures from companies about sustainability issues like climate change, water security, and deforestation.
The Climate Disclosure Project, also known as the CDP, keeps databases so that investors can compare sustainability data. In 2021, over 13,000 companies reported through the CDP.
On the show, we talked to Paul about the future of sustainability, new sustainability reporting regulations, and optimism in the face of climate change. I would just love to hear a little bit about what's the present state of CDP and where is it going next?
Well, CDP's been consistently expanding. We originally went out to 500 largest companies in the world, and about 243 responded to our first information request in 2002. And we stayed at that sample size for about 3 years, and then we started really expanding into much larger groups. Key development for us was in 2006, really, when an intern at Walmart had a big experience responding to CDP, and then an intern at Walmart, she said to her bosses, "Why don't we do this with our supply chain?" And they were like, "Wow," and phoned us, and we were like, "Wow." So never underestimate the genius of the intern. But now, if you look at the graph of CDP's growth, it's very, very consistent year on year. And the state of play is, well, an ecosystem has been building up over the years. It started off with consultants, and then it's kind of auditors and verification partners. But I think one of the most exciting entrants to the market more recently, and Tim, you and I are both involved with the company Persefoni, but is the development of software platforms that can actually support the accurate aggregation of greenhouse gas data, helping to reduce the cost of external audit and verification. And I think most importantly, feeding into the next phases of decarbonization.
Right. So, we need to radically change our economy much quicker than really we'd expect or hope. It has to be so radical and so fast. And I guess governments are not necessarily holding up to their side of the coin right now. So what is the role of corporations in combating climate change? How powerful can they be?
Oh, they can be plenty powerful. I have a little model of the world that the citizen is ruled by the government, but the government is kind of ruled by the corporations, to be honest with you. There are more lobbyists in Brussels than there are civil servants at the European Union. So there is an enormous influence of industry over government. And that's kind of, it is what it is. Maybe it means that some products are a bit more healthy or a bit less healthy, or maybe there's not as much freedom in some markets as others. But when you're dealing with national security, when you're dealing with global security, this little game of business lobbying suddenly becomes what Churchill called the crux of the whole war. So right now, I think probably the most exciting trend we're seeing in industry, is people kind of saying, oh, I'm now got to recognize, from a political perspective, and I'm going to use the word political with a small p, so I'm not talking about party politics here. Mm-hmm. I don't think, the amount of greenhouse gas emissions going up into the atmosphere, that's not a party political issue. That's foundational politics. That's national security. Every company now has to ask themselves, am I part of the problem or am I part of the solution? If you're part of the problem, you're probably going to have the wrong capital investment decisions. You're going to face taxation and regulation. If you're part of the solution, you're supporting our legislators around the world to tax and regulate greenhouse gas emissions, to recycle through tax revenues from high carbon emitters to low carbon emitters, because basically poor people emit less carbon than rich people. And out of that process, get the laws we need to reduce emissions at 7% a year between now and 2030. But I mean, you're absolutely right, Caitlin. It kind of all has to happen yesterday. And business is in the headlights of like which way the world jumps now.
You may remember, Paul, I was a former regulator once in my life. And, disclosure, it's one theory of change. We shine a light on something and it gets better. But, to be honest, I don't think it has gotten better. I think we've just been counting the number of carbon tons, and that number has not really gone down. In fact, many people are saying it's continuing to rise. So, is disclosure working, or do we need to do something else to meet these radical changes and reductions that need to happen now across all sectors?
Yeah, I mean, you could look at any issue, I guess, something like gun control. You could sort of say how many guns are sold, right? You need to know how many guns are being sold to understand how serious the problem is. Is that going to stop people using them inappropriately, having kind of shootings? No. But it's the data you need to kind of get your head around the problem. You're absolutely right, Tim.
These are good metaphors, but let's pause for a second. Paul is suggesting that sustainability disclosure is important, but it also needs to be paired with other methods of enforcement for companies to actually change their practices.
So the measurement is absolutely critical, but if it's not linked to taxation and regulation that cause behavior change, it is, of course, kind of going to achieve nothing. You could say the same about cigarettes. You need to know how many cigarettes are being sold in your society, but it's the taxation and regulation of them that will stop people from smoking.
So, Paul, picking up on that theme, where's CDP going next? You have 13,000 companies reporting. You're probably managing, or not managing, but sort of tallying up many billions of tons of carbon being emitted now throughout the world. Where do you see it going from here?
Well, we are a not-for-profit, or actually a group of not-for-profits. We're a 501c3 in the US. We're a UK-registered charity, so-called. We're an AISBL in Belgium, in Europe. And, a large part of where we're going is related to our philanthropic donors, to be honest. So we are to some degree constrained by resources. Actually, about 50% of our income is commercial, 50% is philanthropic. But as we gather the resources, what we have agreed to do in March 2020 strategically was to expand beyond climate change. You may be aware that we also cover the drivers of deforestation, and we have done that for about 10 years. We also cover water security, and we have done that for about 10 years, but we will expand to issues such as biodiversity, plastic, and we've got funded projects in that area at the moment, kind of pilots looking at how it might work. And we want to cover also things like oceans, topsoil, air quality, and at some point in the future, the S of sustainability issues. I mean, Tim, you used to run the Global Reporting Initiative, and we could always see that holistic grasp of the sort of system conditions that are threatened is actually where corporations need to go. I think we've done well to sort of focus on climate change and to build legitimacy in the dialogue. But I mean, we do need to extend this.
There's been this push by organizations like Paul's and the Global Reporting Initiative to make sustainability disclosures uniform and common practice. And the good news is, they've been fairly successful. Some governments are considering regulating sustainability disclosures. But even once those regulations are created, Paul is saying that the CDP will still have loads of work to do. They plan to work on issues like biodiversity and plastic use.
You really just can't take any one issue necessarily and pull it out. The basis of the sustainability problem, I believe, is problems that government can't fix. And governments have problems on a number of different fronts, and they've kind of got to be solved together for our society to be able to kind of get out of the very dangerous place it's in.
I think that the notion that the world is warming and that has significant impacts for not just our financial system, but all humankind is much more sort of commonly known. And I wanted to say accepted, but maybe reviled is a better word. I don't know if you're familiar with the Marshmallow Experiment, but the Marshmallow Experiment goes back to the late 1960s. And it's a kind of like a parable about how human beings are terrible about planning ahead. They took preschool children and they gave them a marshmallow and said, I'm going to walk out of the room. When I come back, if there's that marshmallow is still there, I'll give you another one. Well, you can imagine what happened. Most of them ate the marshmallow. Some of them looked at it, sniffed it, walked around the room, and then ate it. But about 90% of them ate the marshmallow. So it just shows you that we cannot really think long term. We know what's in front of us now, and we want that thing. Regardless of the consequences, it's really hard for human beings to plan ahead for, what's to come. And that's what climate change is. It's a massive looming threat, but it's out there somewhere. And it's hard to get people to really motivate around that.
Right.
I also think, those corporations maybe are a little bit like those preschool children. And, every quarter, analysts grill the chief executive on a call and say, why haven't you eaten the marshmallow?
Exactly.
Growing up, even me as well, with learning about climate change, I was like, when are governments going to do something? So worried. And it's so great to see that progress that, you can join together and work from the bottom up and then actually influence, regulation to climate advocates and activists and everyone protesting on the street. That is an ounce of hope, really. The new SEC climate disclosure proposal. Obviously, that's really big news in the US. Can we talk just very briefly about what the SEC is and what this proposal means?
Well, I have to say we are so happy about that change. Our whole mission really has been to make a path that regulators can follow and feel confident to follow. In fact, whenever we talk to anyone in a government or whatever, we say, look, CDP is a regulatory impact assessment. Just look, all the biggest companies in your country are already reporting these data. So why don't you just make it into a regulation and then everyone will be able to, respond the same way.
Okay, so a little bit more about the recent SEC proposal. The SEC is the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US, and its job is to oversee the financial and investment markets. Recently, the SEC proposed rules that would force companies to disclose climate information as part of their financial reporting.
There is scope for CDP actually to withdraw from requesting these data in those particular markets where it's regulated. Mm-hmm. And we look forward to that also because we want to continue pushing forward into these other areas like biodiversity, like oceans and so on. But it will take a while, actually, because regulators can be quite slow. And if I just tell a little sad story from the UK, we've kind of regulated greenhouse gas emissions, and then we've kind of stopped bothering, and then we're just about to regulate them again. So, governments can blow a little bit with the wind. But CDP, I think, ultimately, we see ourselves as a little bit of a staging platform for reporting in a number of different jurisdictions. But also, this is exactly where a company like Persefoni is also able to support. CDP will define global demands, but then, people are going to need service providers to actually deliver on those global demands.
Right.
Paul, you deserve so much credit for getting this movement started. And now we have 22 years later come to this point where all of the voluntary disclosures that have happened over those 22 years have really created this body of information that investors, companies, stakeholders of all kinds want to see because they want to know, who's responsible for climate change and what can we do about it. That is, in fact, the embodiment of your theory of change. It's fantastic. But because of that, the investors are demanding the information in a consistent, reliable, and comparable form because the voluntary markets have really not produced that kind of investor grade information for them. And so you're seeing these regulators, capital market regulators, such as, the NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange are capital markets. That's where companies sell their shares. They're saying, look, if you're going to sell your shares publicly, you have to disclose what you're doing, not just about your finances, which kind of keep the financial system going, but also about your climate risks. This is essential for the stability of our financial system. Therefore, we're going to start to pass regulations. And this is not just happening in the US with the Securities and Exchange Commission, but we're seeing it in the UK, we're seeing it in Japan, we're seeing it in the EU, Singapore, Hong Kong. Many other capitals are saying, look, this is a global issue. We're going to respond globally. And I think this is fantastic. It's moving in the right direction. But I would ask you, Paul, as a founder of this, as the kind of, we always joke around with the OG of sustainability or the OG of climate. I don't even know what it means, but I think you're one of them.
Well, OG in slang also means original gangster. In this context, we use it to mean one of the pioneers or one of the legends in the field. And Paul truly deserves this OG status. He's been working in sustainability for over 20 years.
As one of the guys who got this started, does this look like success, or does it look like maybe it might put you out of business?
No, I mean, being put out of business would be a success for sure.
Interesting.
There's lots of private sector things I could do to try and, kind of build up my non-existent pension. You have no idea how poor you get when you spend 22 years working in an NGO, I can tell you. So being put out of business is ideal, actually. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon because, if it's taken them 22 years to regulate on climate change, how long is it going to take them to regulate on biodiversity? How long is it going to take them? I mean, hopefully it can be done faster.
Right.
And there are social system conditions also that need looking at. But I was really surprised when we started CDP, when we first launched, tiny organization. The UK Prime Minister wrote us a letter of support, which was nice. We then went over to New York, and the former Secretary of State, recently deceased Madeleine Albright, spoke at our launch event. And she said, our business is to help investors vote with their money. And then the new Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, in 2006 wrote the introduction to our German report. And then the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, wrote the introduction to our 2009 report. And this has carried on to the point whereby one of our last acts as Chancellor was Angela Merkel to speak at our German launch in 2021, the same year that the Japanese Prime Minister spoke at our launch in Tokyo in 2021. Then there's a new Japanese Prime Minister who spoke at our launch in Tokyo in 2022. Now, why do the heads of the largest countries and the United Nations support CDP? It is because we're not really so much of a civil society organization, but we're a coordinating force for the corporations and the investors who are widely recognized as the most powerful organizations in the world. So the reason I wanted to emphasize this, Caitlin, is that I think it's up to all generations, the youth movement, civil society, to work with investors and corporations to change their direction, because I think the governments are more likely to follow that leadership rather than lead that followership.
Right. Yeah. I really like that kind of idea as well. On, myself and my friends on our dark days, we're kind of like, well, we're just one person. We can't make that much of a difference, right? But I think it's just nice to hear a genuine success story of, working from the bottom up and then making tangible change and governments following. That's just incredible, really.
Let me just say that the way we did it was nobody ever cared about us, right? But what we did do is we went to a whole bunch of investors and we said, look, we can get you some free information. We just need to use your name. Do you want some free information on climate change? Could be very useful for you. And so we were kind of we were only a small organization, 3-4 people in the early days. So it didn't cost so much to fund us. But the point I wanted to come back to you on, Caitlin, is that we managed to make ourselves useful to two very powerful groups. We made ourselves useful to investors, and in exchange, they let us use their name, and then we could use the name of the big investors to get action from the corporations. So it's kind of, it's playing a role. You're small, but you connect to the big forces to achieve something that they want, and then you've got their power.
I'm reminded by a comment that UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres made when he said that the real criminals are not the protesters who are blocking traffic in the streets over climate change. The real criminals are the countries that are saying they'll take action but are doing nothing, and in fact increasing their usage of fossil fuels and carbon emissions. So how do you respond to that when we have so much attention, we have so many lofty statements being made, but we have this lack of action? regardless of how much disclosure we have, how many carbon tons we've counted, the overall trend is not good.
Well, I guess I react the same way everyone does, which is with kind of fear and foreboding. I mean, the truth is that if you look at, I don't know, things that people do with energy, they kind of heat or cool their homes, they travel around, they eat steak, they fly long distances.
They eat marshmallows.
They eat marshmallows. I don't think we've got time to kind of create an alternative utopia. People say system change, not climate change. Well, I kind of agree. But how quickly can we really change the system? Now, one thing that we can do is we can put these taxes on. So, for example, if having a steak, costs $200, basically everyone's going to stop doing it, or most people are going to stop doing it. Mm-hmm. If flying places on holiday costs kind of, 3 or 4 or 5 times as much as it does at the moment, then most people are going to stop doing it. So unfortunately, that's what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to, and it probably won't last forever. Probably for about 10 or 15 years, things like steak and flying a long distance are going to be really expensive. But hey, here's where it gets interesting. There will probably be things that taste as good, if not better, than the best steak made of vegetables in about 10 years.
So there are solutions. We don't want to be completely pessimistic. I do think that many of the things you talked about, in fact, are happening. We're seeing electrification of the vehicle fleet. We're seeing alternative fueled aircraft. We're seeing all sorts of things that I wouldn't have thought possible just a few years ago. So I think it's extremely exciting. We should hear from our 9th level vegan, Caitlin, about choices about diet. What do you think, Caitlin?
Yeah, so I'm very passionate about veganism and vegetarianism and kind of trying to make it the biggest individual impact you can. But I'm also seeing lots of really interesting food science and food scientists coming out. I always run to, a Tesco in the UK and try out all the new cool plant-based meats. But also even like the idea of technological advancements. I know lab-grown meat is becoming a big thing as well, which is very interesting to see how that develops, that works out. And I think like in many ways, people who maybe do eat meat, that's a better alternative for them long-term to try out if they're a bit too hesitant, right? So I think you're right, Paul, there's a little bit of a transition period that we'll have to go through where people might have to sacrifice things that they don't necessarily want to. But maybe as the technology develops and as, we continue a bit down the line, then we can have those luxuries and those kind of creature comforts again.
Sure. I mean, the danger with lab-grown meat is there's going to be 100-meter long lab-grown meat, and I can see it kind of maybe bursting out of its pen and, marching through our cities like in some kind of Godzilla movie. So I just, that's, I think plants, we're okay with plants, but I'm, this giant lab-grown, bit scary, but hopefully it won't, like the Terminator. Can you imagine being eaten by a burger?
Okay, before my next question, let's explain lab-grown meat a little bit better and why it's a more sustainable option, because it's not as scary as it sounds. Basically, scientists have figured out how to use stem cells from animals to grow meat in a petri dish. That cuts down on greenhouse gas emissions from livestock, the amount of water livestock need, especially the amount of food they need, and most definitely the amount of space they need. The technology isn't commonly used yet, but it's just one example of the many sustainability innovations that could change the world.
Caitlin could talk about this all day, but let's switch gears.
I wanted to ask a little bit about your podcast, Paul. Your podcast is titled Outrage and Optimism. And I was kind of wondering, when it comes to climate change, how can you balance both of those?
Well, I think they're both very much required. The privilege I have is to do a podcast with Christiana Figueres, who is the mother of the Paris Agreement.
Christiana Figueres is a sustainability legend. Like Paul said, she was instrumental in getting the Paris Climate Agreement passed. And that agreement was historic. It got most of the major emitting countries to agree to curb their pollution with the goal of limiting global warming.
She brought the whole world together in an unprecedented global agreement. And I will never forget, sitting there in the front row in Paris and the hammer came down and then Russia said, this is great. And USA said, this is great. And China said, this is great. And Saudi Arabia said, this is great. And I was just like, wow, this is like everybody. But okay, so Christiana, when she did a great TED talk a couple of years later, talking about how Paris happened, she talked about how the first thing that she put into the system was optimism. And then from optimism, all these other things came along, like the business case, the investment, civil society, the whole mood. So optimism is an enabler, but the outrage, I think, is necessary recognition that, for most of us right now, our lives have changed hardly at all. But if you're in a precarious place in the world, sub-Saharan Africa, if you're in Bangladesh, in a lot of the Delta there, climate change is no joke now. There are a lot of people dying right now from climate change, a lot of people. So that's where the outrage comes from. And I think that the outrage is there to drive us. And then the optimism is to help us be effective when we're trying to change a big global and societal system. But the good news is, if this is quite the word, but extreme weather has brought it all home to people. And, you hats off to the school strikers. I mean, it is absolutely stunning. In all of human history, I don't believe the children have ever gone on strike before. This is entirely unprecedented. But it kind of surfaces how ridiculous the situation is. Most parents would say, well, I would do anything for my children. Well, no, you're not. You are not protecting your children. And by the way, your children have gone on strike to point out you're not. And it's funny because it reveals how confused humans are in a certain way. Like if you imagine an actual child is threatened in front of their actual parent, the parent will jump in front of the bullet heading for the child, no question about it. But if you sort of say, well, we got to increase gasoline taxes, then, that's somehow, you can say, well, I don't care about my children. And connecting that disconnect is the art of this.
Caitlin and I work together once a week on a newsletter, and we try to sum up the climate news. And oftentimes we have these discussions and debates about doom and gloom. Because to be honest, if we spend too much time in this outrage state, I think we almost defeat ourselves because you feel somewhat powerless in the end. At some point, you have to rein in the outrage to turn it into optimism and therefore action. And I think back to those days you mentioned of the Paris Climate Accord. That's 7 years ago. 7 years ago, right? And if it kind of feels like, as you said, it goes in ebbs and flows, and maybe that's okay. Maybe it's not a sort of linear upward curve. Maybe it's kind of a bumpy curve that we're on, but potentially the direction of travel is right. I do try to find myself grasping for optimism so that I don't have to go lay down and take a nap, because too much rage makes me fatigued.
Well, let me give you one bit of optimism to cheer you up. And this is a very personal story, but I used to study, I guess you would call it the internet, the corporate internet. Back in from about 1995, 1996 onwards, I was a kind of internet researcher. And, people didn't really get browsers properly till about 2000. So it was in the emerging years of the kind of popular internet. Do you know, I went to a talk in 1996 where somebody said they're going to change the rules and the internet is going to allow commercial websites, and we've got to stop it now, because if we don't stop it now, the internet will be full of like shops and things like that, and it's our last chance to but I mean, it's actually true that until 1996 it was illegal to have a commercial website on the internet. I just think that's, it's hard to imagine now, right? But in that process in 1996, I was at a seminar, and it suddenly hit me that video communication could be absolutely enormous and could take out about half of human travel. And I would give speeches about how important video communication was going to be in the future and how we could cut down so much transport. And then, COVID-19 has been a big disaster, but I felt like Charles Atlas holding this world of video communication. And then COVID-19 meant that I could simply put that down because a couple of billion people went on a serious video communication training course. And, Zoom and then Teams came up to scratch. And now we're in a different world. Yes. And our ability to materially reduce greenhouse gas emissions from particularly commuting and unnecessary business travel, so it's a bit of a sad story that has to be around a terrible pandemic where millions of people have died.
Right.
But I just wanted to give it as one very positive story. And there are going to be so many more of these stories.
Paul's involved with a bunch of different passion projects. So, to wrap up our conversation, we talked about how all of them are connected to each other and to sustainability. One is an NGO focused on responsible investment called Share Action. Another is a clothing company. Here, Paul explains what it's all about.
Yes, I'm also involved in a clothing business called Gender Free World. My business partner for 19 years in video conferencing, she was really disturbed by the fact that so many clothes, particularly shirts for women, were highly feminized, kind of pink and lace and frilly. And she's like, why can't women just buy fun shirts like men do? So we have an amazing range of fun shirts that we sell at genderfreeworld.com and in 4 different body shapes, because it's very often the case that, people are different body shapes. And why don't clothing companies, we sell in different sizes, but why not different shapes? So that's been a great fun business. And I thought I'd only work on climate change, but Lisa said to me, this is about equality. So I was like, okay, equality, that's important.
It goes to the point, the more serious point, that everything is all connected. When I think about apparel and its supply chain and how people, encounter apparel, I think about war and what it's doing to, fuel prices. I mean, there is this great connectedness to the whole world. And again, Paul, to your point about authoritarian governments sort of getting exposed for what they are, it leaves me, when you sort of weigh the outrage and optimism, with much more optimism from this conversation. And hopefully, Caitlin, as a young person in this world, that resonates with you as well.
Yeah, no, we're never going to be able to leave it to Caitlin to fix. We've got to fix it. And then, actually, probably we're all Caitlin. Your grandchildren, Caitlin, will be Caitlin. That all we're ever really doing is passing it on.
That's true. We can't just say, well, here you go. This was our problem. Now it's yours. It doesn't work that way. As somebody with 5 grandchildren, I feel a desperate responsibility, a quite urgent responsibility to do whatever I can while I'm still able to scurry around on this earth.
And you have done so much, Tim, so you should be very proud of that.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate that. Well, it's just been a fantastic conversation. You are such an inspiration to all, Paul, with your credentials in CDP and beyond into other businesses, and just your amazing observations about the connectedness of the world. Again, I'm leaving with a fresh sense of optimism and ready to take on these problems.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. Thank you, Tim. Great to talk to you today.
What an amazing conversation. I mean, Paul Dickinson is not only a founder of the sustainability movement, but his observations sort of tying everything together, the connectedness, the balance of optimism and outrage. I found it to be just such an engaging conversation.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting that he's been able to pick up so many kind of different endeavors as well. Alongside CDP, like we were talking about, he's working with Share Action. He has a clothing brand. Like, all of those things also highlight the connectedness of it all. Everything comes down to influencing climate change and climate change influencing it, right? They're not mutually exclusive. It's all kind of connected. I think that was a wonderful theme from the conversation.
I think Paul's career fits the phrase, he's never had a job because he has a calling. But my goodness, what a fabulous conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul.
That's it for our episode with Paul Dickinson.
If you want to read up more about Paul's work in the Carbon Disclosure Project, you can visit cdp.net.
The link is in our show notes.
Before we go, Please don't forget to subscribe to Sustainability Decoded with Tim and Caitlin on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. While you're there, it would be great if you could rate and review the show. Thank you all for listening, and we'll catch you in our next episode.
Sustainability Decoded is produced by our incredible team at Persefoni and Hueman Group Media. If you want to learn more about Persefoni and our climate management and accounting platform, please visit our website, persefoni.com.